Greetings from India. My name is Snigdha Basu and I will be moderating today's session. I'm associated with the current project of Tell Me a Story as an assistant, and I am also a postgraduate student of English literature. I welcome you to the Stories of Food and Drinks Shaping Cultural Identity and Ideology, curated under TMYS Review September 2022 in collaboration with York Center for Asian Research, York University, and Reader. We are also calling for submissions of essays, poems, and short stories under the project. To know more about the submission guidelines and the project architecture, please visit tellmeastory.biz. This evening, I consider myself very privileged to be in the company of our esteemed panelists, Dr. Mustafa Shaikh and Victoria Vanstone, who will shortly share their views and insights with us. The topic for today's discussion is Prohibition and Taboo of Alcohol Across Cultures and Religions under the theme Drinks in Culture and Cultural Drinks. Before we begin, I would like to introduce our speakers. Our first speaker for the session is Dr. Mustafa Shaikh. He is Associate Professor of Islamic Thought and Muslim Societies in the Department of Arabic, Islamic, and Middle Eastern Studies in the School of Languages, Cultures, and Societies at the University of Leeds. He is founding co-director of the Iqbal Center for Critical Muslim Studies, a center that has a commitment to building links between the university and the wider Muslim community. Dr. Sheikh's areas of expertise include Ottoman history, Islamic law and legal theory, Muslim intellectual history, and Islamic finance. We're delighted to have you with us, sir, today. Thank you for joining the panel.
Thank you for having me.
Our second speaker for the session is Victoria Manstone. Victoria is the host of Australia's most popular sobriety podcast, Sober Awkward. She started writing about addiction and parenting on the day she gave up alcohol 4 years ago. Since then, she has penned a book about sober parenting and also writes the blog drunkmummysobermommy.com. Victoria has become an alcohol-free living advocate and is passionate about helping others stuck in a pattern of normalized social binge drinking. She has three young children and is originally from the UK. She lives on the Sunshine Coast in Australia. Honored to have you with us, ma'am, today. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
We now open the forum for discussion. I would like to request Dr. Sheikh to share his insights on today's topic of discussion.
Okay, thank you, Snigdha. I would just request if I can have my slides brought up because it will just help me to kind of just talk through some of the things that I'm working on around the question of Islam, Muslim communities, Muslim societies, and alcohol. I want to say a couple of weeks ago, three or 4 weeks ago, actually, I was in Kazakhstan, which is a Muslim country, very, very, in terms of geography, probably the largest Muslim country in the Muslim world. And Kazakhstan's a really, really interesting place. It's in Central Asia, just north of Uzbekistan and immediately south of Russia. It's a passionately Muslim country, and is rediscovering its kind of religious heritage after many decades under kind of Russian influence and communist rule. And when I went there, it's the first visit there, I was struck by not just how passionately Kazakhs are about their religion and their faith, but also how prevalent alcohol is. Almost everywhere I went, I saw alcohol. And it wasn't just in spaces where you would expect perhaps it to be, sort of irreligious spaces, but actually even in quite religious settings. And that really struck me. And I was already aware that I would come across alcohol when visiting there. And many visitors to Central Asia are aware of this. So I was ignorant, but it struck me just how prevalent alcohol is there. And for me, I immediately started to link it to my own work, which is really about the long history of alcohol in Muslim societies, right back to the very beginnings of Islam. The Quran has a lot to say about alcohol, wine, not just wine from grapes, but also wine from dates. There are mentions in the Quran in different places of wine, not just in this world, in the here and the now, as it were, and the kind of pleasures, but also the harms. but also wine in the context of the next world, as a reward for believers or good people, for the good deeds that they do whilst in the temporal world. So the Quran has a lot to say about wine and or more generally alcohol. And so I was in Kazakhstan thinking about, well, yeah, I can understand how this is, because there isn't one position on alcohol, although that's the perception, not just outside Islam, but also within Islam. Many Muslims would say, if you ask them, what's Islam's position on alcohol, they would say, Islam prohibits alcohol, full stop. And just travel through the Muslim world today, go to Turkey, go to parts of North Africa, go to Sudan, you will find, indeed, Central Asia, like I visited recently, you'll find alcohol of many different types available. Now, in Kazakhstan, I came across vodka spirits largely. It seems to be that's what they're most most love in Kazakhstan. But they also had, and I came across this in a large supermarket, fermented horse milk. And that's a very similar kind of alcohol to a beverage that you'll find in other parts of the Muslim world. In Sudan, for example, they have a wheat-based drink that's made, in particularly in Ramadan, which is one of the most holy times of the Muslim calendar. And there are raki. People who have visited Turkey will know, well, this is a drink, it's a spirit that has a long history in Turkey or in the Ottoman Empire, going back hundreds of years. So it's really interesting when you travel the Muslim world today, you'll find alcohol available, not just modern forms, but also traditional forms of it. And I don't think people should be surprised by that, because whilst in Islam, there certainly were positions in Islamic law in particular, of particular schools of law where alcohol was outright banned, no form of it was deemed acceptable. There were certainly schools of thought which saw in alcohol a utility. And so I just wanted to begin by making that point, really. There are, this is in my first slide here, mentions of alcohol in the Quran as a reward for believers in paradise. And there's one verse just there for you to see, where the God conscious are promised as a reward rivers of water, the purest water that one can ever imagine, but also rivers of milk, the taste whereof never alters, and rivers of wine delightful to those who drink it, but also rivers of honey. And these are not just rewards in the next life, but to the early Muslims and to the first audience of the Quran, these were drinks that were sort of the most beloved to kind of the first Muslim community. Wine was certainly prevalent and loved, but also honey was consumed. Water, interestingly, less so, because it's not always been the most safest thing to drink. And that's not just in Muslim societies, but globally, because of the bacteria, pathogens that can be passed through water. The ability to drink water as we do on tap is a fairly recent thing, and it's only been made possible because of technologies for water purification. But actually, even a couple of hundred years ago, across the Muslim world, water might not have been the go-to drink. And that's something I've looked at in my research. And so fruit juices, for example, are far more popular in Muslim history. And there's a good reason for that. And that's because fruit juice will have very small levels of alcohol. I mean, it may be 0.05%, or, slightly more or slightly less, but usually enough to certainly, sort of kill some level of, of bacteria, harmful microbes. Higher levels of alcohol in drink, obviously, or in foods, will kill a far greater range of microbes and harmful bacteria. But alcohol is in everything, virtually, in bread, for example, of some degree. And So I think it's an important point to consider, especially for the view that holds that alcohol is we have to have a complete ban on it. There's a question around to what extent that's actually possible, given that alcohol is in so many foods and drinks. And I give the example of fruit juice. And so these things were really widely available in early Islam. But clearly there's a moment also in Muslim history when a discourse of prohibition begins. And that's actually much later than one might think, especially general prohibition. For me, my research suggests or indicates that it happens a few hundred years after the revelation of the Quran, and is probably linked actually to new technologies which allow the creation of higher, or more pure alcoholic liquids, and that's distillation technologies actually, which make that a possibility. And for me, I detect in the kind of history of Islamic thought a certain change in the discourse around that time onwards, and a greater connection between negative effects of alcohol and kind of societal behavior and so on. So that's some of the things that I've been really interested in looking at in my research. I'm just going to talk a little bit about in the Quran, there are certainly references to the harmful effects of alcohol. And there, for example, in Quran chapter 5, verse 90, where wine, games of chance, sacrifices at altars, and divining arrows are all deemed impure practices. It's a verse which, especially Muslim jurists who decided that alcohol must be absolutely prohibited, they cite this verse and do a lot of kind of commentary on it. And it's an important verse, and I think it's fairly clear about the fact that wine is a problem, but in what way it's a problem specifically isn't quite clear in the verse. Is it because it intoxicates, or is it that it's a substance that, juxtaposed with games of chance, sacrifices at altars, is something that's connected with perhaps irreligious paganistic practices that don't really align, or that Islam won't ever accommodate because it's a monotheistic religion. I mean, there's a whole discussion around that. Why is wine problematized in this verse? And some of my research, I've looked at that, and I'm actually of the view that in this verse, it's not because wine is intoxicating per se, but red wine in particular is often used in particular religious traditions as a substitute for blood. And in Christianity, you see that in the Eucharist and its use. And I think that actually what the Quran is doing in this particular place is problematizing wine for a very specific purpose. That's not to say that the Quran is okay with drunkenness. There's a verse, Quran, Surah 4:43, do not go to prayer while you're intoxicated. I don't think any Muslims, whether jurists or lay, would ever say that intoxication is okay. It's not, and the Quran is very clear on that. But the debate is really around what about drinking alcohol to levels below intoxicating levels, and that's where the majority of Muslims in Muslim history, at least the majority of jurists, were of the view that alcohol should be avoided completely because it's a slippery slope. But there were always a group of jurists of the Hanafi school in particular, which also is the school that predominates in places like Central Asia, which held that alcohol of different forms are permitted to drink up until the point of intoxication, but one should avoid getting anywhere near intoxicated, and if they do, they will be subject to kind of a punishment of one form or another. So this is just some of the things that I've been working on. I mean, I don't want to talk too long. I'm sure you'll have some questions for me, Snigdha, but it's something that I find really interesting, an interesting aspect of Islamic thought in Muslim societies.
Thank you, sir, for a very insightful observation. I would now like to request Victoria ma'am to share her insights on the topic. Over to you, ma'am.
Well, I just find it so amazing listening to Mustapha and hearing the history of, alcohol in the Muslim religion. I come from a non-religious background, but obviously I respect anyone's choices as to how they live their life. And for me, it's been very, very different to probably Mustafa's background, I'd say, because I come from a culture where I think drinking was expected of me growing up. Which is the complete opposite of in the Quran. We were never told not to drink. I come from a family who were big drinkers. You could describe them as binge drinkers. Alcohol was never seen as a negative thing. It was a negative impact in the family that I grew up in. It was always frivolous and celebratory. Nobody drank to commiserate. It was always full of joy, the drinking that I saw when I was a child. So for me, drinking was never something I wanted to avoid. It was something that was going to make me accepted into my community, accepted into my family, and I guess which is a way of me feeling love, if we were going to take it down to the basics. So growing up, I just watched this kind of cheerful pandemonium going on around me, and I wanted to be part of it. I never considered not drinking. Which I guess now looking back is a shame because I never had the opportunity to make my own choices about alcohol back then. But growing up, the cultures that surrounded me were all pushing me in the same direction. I don't think I really had a choice to be anything but a drinker. I label myself now as a socially acceptable alcoholic. I don't necessarily like that word because it conjures up the wrong image of me. I was never, passed out on a floor with a baby crawling over me covered in my own vomit, although I probably have done that a few times in my past. I generally am not the image of what you would expect an alcoholic to look like or to be like. I'm somebody that followed in my parents' footsteps and drank socially to a level that was a level of intoxication, which led me to do things that I would not have done sober. So the level that Mustapha was talking about there, which is kind of getting to a point where you're enjoying a drink and you have one glass and you stop. I was never taught that style of drinking. It was more get as much drink down you can as you can, and then, fall over or go into a blackout. So I grew up everywhere that I looked throughout my youth. It was this culture, this English pub culture, or this club culture, or there was something called the ladette culture, which was in the 90s when I was in my early 20s. It was women trying to show their masculinity in a way by drinking the men under the table and shouting the rounds of drinks. So my environment, my culture, and this big pie chart of things that turns you into an overdrinker, I was the perfect candidate because I didn't have a negative view of it. I think I was never told not to do it. And for me, I think it gave me perhaps a personality and an identity because I wanted to fit in. It made me more confident with boys to chat to when I was, a kind of a shy teenager. And it gave me all the things that I wanted at those young ages. So I obviously saw that it made people more relaxed, and I wanted that for myself. So yeah, I started drinking in a very, very normal way, the teenager way, and that just developed throughout my whole life into more of a drinking problem, I would say. It wasn't a problem as far as an alcoholic, but I call myself as well a grey area binge drinker. And what they are is people who get inebriated probably once or twice a week beyond a normal level. So somebody who goes out and gets drunk at the weekend on a social level. It hasn't been really recognized as a problem drinker before because it's the type of drinking where you get a pat on the back on the way back from the bar and all your mates are kind of, saying, well done, mate, get another round. So it was always the kind of drinking, as I said, that was cheered on from the sidelines. No one would have ever picked me out of the crowd and said, you've got a problem drinker there on your hands. They would have just gone, wow, Vic, isn't she a great party girl? So it's very the opposite, of course, that me and Mustapha are talking about today. He's talking about a very sort of quieter type of drinking than I'm talking about. Mine was a more raucous style of drinking, which completely was my identity. I didn't know who I was without alcohol, and I thought that's why people liked me. So of course, when something becomes your entire identity, it's impossible to see outside of that sort of fuzzy box that I was in for many, many, many years. And it wasn't until I had children in my mid-30s and met someone who liked me for me, my husband, who I'm married to now, that I was able to start questioning my alcohol consumption, and not being on my own for the first time in my life. Excuse me. Let's go have a sip of water. Sorry, it's winter here in Australia, so I've got a bit of a cold on my chest. So yes, I identify now as a grey area drinker, which many, many people are. And it's also called being sober curious. And it's anyone that's ever questioned their relationship with alcohol. So it's anyone who's ever woken up in the morning and thought, gosh, I've got a hangover, I'm never drinking again. And is then waving a tenner at the barman on a Thursday night. So it's anyone who wants to stop alcohol and thinks about it, but can't. Excuse me, I'm going to have a cough. Gosh, sorry about that.
It's fine.
Something got to my throat. Yeah, so it's just a very, very different end of the spectrum. And also in this sort of what we call alcoholism, there is this vast spectrum, like people who have ADHD or autism. There is this vast spectrum of addiction. And I do sit somewhere on that line, where I've discovered in the years of me looking into my drinking habits and researching what was going on with me and why I felt the need to drink within my culture. And I went to therapy when I was after the birth of my first child, and I dug around and found out the reasons why I had become a drinker, which was because of my culture, because I never had a choice, because of everything that was going around me growing up, and because it's so normalized in society now, where I'm from. You know, we're from different countries, us guy, you know, we're in England and India and all over the place. And where I'm from, drinking is so ingrained in society that it almost makes you feel like you don't have a choice not to. And that's the problem that I face every day now being a sober woman, is that I'm going against the grain, I'm going against the norm. I'm like a salmon swimming upriver. Everybody wants you to drink as a woman in her 40s and 50s. You know, our children are growing up and you're going out, and it's just part of the societal norm. And I actually had to give up drinking because it started to give me mental health issues. Every time I drank to excess when I was out with my friends, I woke up the next day with severe anxiety and panic attacks. And that was what caused me to question my drinking habit. And now, the longer that I am sober, which is nearly 5 years, I'm starting to see the impact that alcohol has all over the world, on all religions and every country, is that it's not just the extreme drinkers that are having issues. It's the people that are these grey area drinkers, these sober curious people that are what would be considered to be normal drinkers, that overdo it at the weekend, are suffering into the week. And it's, you know, anxiety, mental health, questioning their behavior, affecting their work capacity or their work fitness. And it's having lots of repercussions in very many areas of society. And that's what I do. I kind of look into all the different aspects alcohol is having impact on our culture today.
Thank you for sharing such invaluable perspectives, ma'am. Now we can move on to the question and answer session. My first question is to Dr. Sheikh. So, even though alcohol consumption is considered a haram, it was the Muslim chemists that really improved the distillation technology. Would you like to tell us a little about that?
Sure. So now, as I've already explained in my kind of opening, there's a perception clearly that, you know, Islam prohibited alcohol, and then there's this 12th century or around then, when Muslims kind of discover distillation and actually coin the term alcohol, which is the modern Western term for, modern Western term, alcohol. So Muslims actually kind of coined that word now, which is the ultimate word for describing in the Western world inebriating beverages. That's a paradox. How do we solve that? And I hope that I've already shown that there isn't really a paradox. It's a lot more complicated than that. And actually, if you look at Islam from the time of the Quran up until sort of the 9th century or 10th century, when Muslim scientists are really working very hard to sort of create some really important technologies, but also are working in alchemy, or kind of what we would say is kind of chemistry, to kind of create perfumes, for example, antiseptics, all these are sort of substances that lead them to develop distillation technologies that can then create also, among other things, liquor. So yes, in a way, liquor is a kind of strange, weird byproduct of other things that they were really interested in creating. And so, yeah, Muhammad bin Zakaria al-Razi, for example, he was probably the person that we ascribe with having created, first distillation technology. But as I say, he was really interested in kind of creating perfume, for example, rose perfume, and perfume is a really important part of Muslim Islamic culture, to smell well and to smell good, but also, as I say, antiseptic for medicinal purposes and so on. But he certainly did also, as a byproduct, probably kind of create very strong spirit type alcohol. And once that was available, there are always going to be people in society that will take to it. And certainly you start to see poetry from that time in which alcohol spirits are described. And there are spirits that are being described because the effects of those are, for example, the heated quality as the drinker consumes or imbibes them. And so you start to see certain Muslim poets like Omar Khayyam, for example, Abu Nuwas, who are describing not just kind of wine now, but actually describing in their poetry spirits, which are only possible through distillation. So that's true. You're absolutely right. Muslims are the first to develop distillation. Alcohol, which is of course alcohol that which is that substance that's used to beautify the eyes, becomes the word that even the West adopts, and it's just an interesting history.
Thank you for answering that, sir. My next question is for Victoria, ma'am. If you look at the mom wine culture in general and even in media, what influence do you believe the media and the culture had on patterns of alcohol consumption among mothers?
Well, of course, there's this mummy wine culture, which is very prevalent on social media. I get a lot of adverts being dropped into my Instagram page and Facebook page because the name Drunk Mummy, Sober Mummy, of course, I'm going to be targeted with all of that. I think the influence is absolutely huge, and it's scary the impacts that it can have on mothers. I think sometimes there's a place which I kind of call my Pinot Gris purgatory, where I was a party girl and I became a mum. And there was a space in between where I wanted to still be myself with that identity that I spoke about earlier, but I also wanted to be a good mum. And so I kind of found myself in this sort of weird purgatory where I didn't know who I was, but was trying to stay home more. But the mundanity of sort of being a new mum would creep up on me, and I'd want to go out again and sort of get drunk and forget about the seriousness of being a new mum and being responsible for a young life for the first time. And of course, the media influence upon me and upon my mother's group and the people around me is us mums, we deserve a reward, like the reward you were talking about in the Quran, which was alcohol is seen as a reward quite often, as if you've had a long day, if you've worked hard, or a celebration, a wedding, whatever it is, it's seen as a reward. And my reward after a long day of being a good mum made me turn into a bad mum because I didn't know there was another way of being. I didn't know there was possible for a mum who was in her mid-30s to not drink. That was never, ever an option for me. So, of course, I started that habit, and I was the perfect candidate, being the party girl before. Everything that I did throughout my life was surrounded by alcohol. So, of course, motherhood was as well. And I just remember adverts coming up on my Facebook page, which was feeding bras, where you could have a bottle of wine next to you with a straw coming into your mouth while you were feeding the baby. They were kind of joke gadgets, I suppose, for new mums to use. But things like that come up all the time. Handbags for mums, where you can sneak a bottle of wine into the pub, and all these different ways. And in fact, what you really realize with all of this, it's just a marketing scheme for these big alcohol companies. It's just another diverse range of people, from mums to teenagers to single people. They're just looking for different groups that they can name their products at. And mums are perfect people because they do want to numb out. And parenting can be very, very overwhelming, of course. So you don't know what you're doing. You've got this huge responsibility. It can be quite scary. And because of my past, the only thing I knew how to do was drink. So I think the media has a huge influence upon that. And I think that they use it for their own gratification financially, to continue using their products for these very targeted audiences.
Thank you for sharing that now. My next question is for Dr. Sheikh. Can you tell us a little about how the teachings relating to alcohol vary between the Sunni and the Shia communities?
Okay, so it's kind of tricky to answer that question if we think about Sunni and Shia communities as monoliths. What you actually have within each community, especially from an Islamic law perspective, are schools within each community that often reflect very different positions. So within the Sunni school of thought, as it were, in terms of law, there are four major schools: the Shafi, Hanafi, Maliki, and Hanbali. Now, three of those four have a very clear position on alcohol. It should be absolutely prohibited. No form of consumption is allowed. But there's one of the four, the Hanafi school, which I describe also as being predominant in areas like modern-day Turkey and Central Asia, which consider alcohol to be permitted up until the point of intoxication. Now, the Shia school of thought also has different legal schools within it. But the Imami school, which is one in particular, the predominant one, is actually in some ways aligned with the Hanafi school of law, in that it had this position of general prohibition of alcohol. But at the same time, as At-Tusi says, who's one of the major thinkers of the Imami school, who dies in 1067, in his book An-Nihaya, he says that whilst alcohol is generally prohibited, there are some substances which have small amounts of alcohol in them, which are okay. And so he mentions, for example, drinks made from mulberries, pomegranates, quinces, honey, rosewater. And he says that they're okay as long as they don't intoxicate in large amounts, and even if they emit the smell of liquor or alcohol. So it's interesting. I think what we need to think about if we're doing comparative work is not just look at the Sunni Shias as two major kind of clusters, but as see the nuances, and you will find actually there are some interesting differences, but also similarities there. So for more on this, if you're interested, I can share my article on my work on alcohol, and I cover some of this stuff in that. If your audience members would be interested to read more.
Sure, sir. My last question is for Victoria, ma'am. So, in 1920, after alcohol became illegal in America, women made, sold, and drank liquor in unprecedented fashion, as written by historian Mary Murphy. What do you think the state-ordered prohibition of alcohol does to a society?
Well, I think I have a very different stance on that than I used to have. I mean, when I was a drinker, of course, it was my life, and it was everything that I did, and every party, every social event was, surrounded by alcohol. This has happened before in England as well. There was something called the Temperance Movement in the early I think it was kind of the 1930s. There was a sort of push of people who gave up drinking and signed a pledge back then. It was started down in the South Coast. People went down to the South Coast. It was we would call it a detox or rehab centre now, where people went down to the South Coast and made themselves feel better and went and dipped themselves in the ocean. But it was actually a sort of rehab, and the people that came out of that those sort of early rehab centres signed something called the pledge, and it was to do with giving up alcohol, because even in those days they realized that alcohol consumed in large quantities was bad for the health. And it's changed over the centuries. Of course, in America, it caused a big underground scene, which I've just been watching in a TV show here that's called Peaky Blinders. I don't know whether you've seen that. It's an English show, and they cover a lot about prohibition in New York in the mid 1920s. And it just shows that doesn't work, I think, more than anything else, because people like freedom of choice. It's like smoking, it's like marijuana, it's like any sort of mid-range, not class A narcotic. It is going to be questionable if people are banned from doing it. I do think things are changing in this scene right now, especially here in Australia and in the UK. When I was growing up, if somebody had handed me an alcohol-free beer, or anyone around me had been drinking an alcohol-free beer, I would have been, quite offended, I think, that somebody would bring that even into my surroundings, because I just couldn't understand why somebody wouldn't drink. And when you're a drinker, actually, you don't like sober people, because you can't understand them, and possibly they're doing something that you could never do. And I always found sober people very confronting. But now I am one. I sort of understand all of the things that I was doing wrong, and how, doing something like prohibition, I would be all for. But I understand that alcohol does have its place if it's used in the correct way. Whereas I think that's the point, is we don't say alcoholism anymore. We call it alcohol misuse disorder, which means that you're misusing the product in itself, in its basic form. We know it all comes from vegetables and these cow milks and all these things, but what it is it is a drug. It is a drug that causes you to act in a way that you wouldn't normally. So I do think that any sort of prohibition would be a great idea, but I also think that there are some people who are capable of using alcohol in the correct way. I wasn't one of them, for various reasons. I misused it because of my culture, my background, and my family, and all those reasons that we discussed earlier. But I do think there are some people that can have one glass of wine at church, or when visiting the temple, or whatever they do as part of their tradition. And I think that's okay, as long as you're not swigging the bottle or hiding it somewhere, or using it in a way where it changes you. For me, alcohol changed me, and it made me into a person that didn't really care about herself, or didn't respect herself, and put herself at risk a lot. And now, looking back and being sober, I can see the error of my ways and saw what alcohol did to me. And I think that gives me a really good perspective, because I can see the impact on the community of alcohol everywhere I go now. But I do think taking it away in some ways would be good. But I think the only way that we can change the culture is by talking about it, which is why I continually talk about the normalization of alcohol and overuse of alcohol in our society. And that's what will change it, and that's what will make people. It's more about education than just taking something away. Educating yourself on being respectful and kind to yourself before you take a drink, and understanding what's going to happen to you if you do over imbibe.
Snigdha, can I just come on very
briefly?
Yeah,
I wanted to ask you what you think the state, if like a state ordered prohibition of alcohol was, what do you think the state ordered prohibition would do in an Islamic country? What response would it like?
Okay, so I just wanted to say thanks for that question. It's something that Victoria said. I think I want to clarify as well that even those Islamic schools of thought which permitted alcohol did so with very clear caveats. And it's very much connected with what Victoria is saying is what are the beneficial uses of alcohol? And they list certain things that alcohol, if it's going to be consumed, should be for situations like the following: as an aid for digestion, so a digestif, as they would say in French, to provide energy for prayer, because it can energize certain types of alcoholic beverage, a bit like these kind of energy drinks that you have today would do that, energize you for good deeds. Dutch courage, actually, because you imagine in pre-modern times, fight warfare wasn't as it is today. You would have to do a lot of hand-to-hand combat. And a bit of Dutch courage, which you would get through alcohol, could actually be the difference between winning war and losing it. And
can I just interrupt you there?
Oh, Victoria, yeah.
It just reminds me very quickly of the kamikaze pilots in Japan. It's very similar. They developed methamphetamine for them to use when they were going up in the planes to basically to die, but they felt invincible at the time because the drug had made them capable of doing that job. So it's a similar thing, isn't it? It's like using alcohol for a purpose.
Exactly.
In a restricted way. Yeah,
exactly. And I think that general prohibition therefore is almost an impossibility, especially when you think about medication. Now, not just alcohol, but opioids. These are the base for many types of anesthetic. And so, you get this impossible situation when a state tries to do an absolute ban on alcohol. It's kind of the other extreme to, complete openness and libertinism around alcohol. So I think alcohol in its nature is ambivalent, and then how we react to it and respond is always so ambivalent and interesting. It's just a fascinating topic, really, to be thinking about. So, yeah, thanks, Snigdha, for that question.
Thank you, sir, and thanks, Victoria, ma'am. So with that, we come to an end to today's discussion. I thank both of you for sharing your knowledge and valuable insight with us. I'm sure our audience had a wonderful time and have learned a lot as well. We are grateful to you for taking your time from your extremely busy schedules and for being a part of this discussion. It was an absolute pleasure to be in your company today. This is to remind that we are calling for submissions for food and drinks, the details of which can be viewed on our website. Good night, everyone.